Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction. I'm super glad to be here. My second talk here at the Techconference Vienna this year. And my first talk was also about OpenAI, but the first talk was very much about coding. And the second talk will be about, as you said, Azure OpenAI. This one is important. I will focus on Azure OpenAI. So if you are interested in deploying your own OpenAI endpoints in the Azure cloud, then this is exactly the talk that is correct for you. So, who am I? Why am I here? My name is Stropek. I'm a Microsoft MVP and Regional Director. It does not mean that I'm on the payroll of Microsoft, not at all. I'm working as a software developer, as a software architect in my own company. We're called Software Architects. And beside that, I'm chairman of the Coding Club Linz. We run programming clubs for kids, and I'm a part-time teacher. So my entire life consists of mainly coding. My professional life and my free time, I spend a lot of time coding because that is what I like. If you would like to get in touch with me or keep in touch with me, feel free to visit my digital business card. It's available at stropek.me, and on the right lower corner you find a lot of links to social media platforms, including LinkedIn. Feel free to connect up with me and send me direct messages if you have any follow-up questions. The sample code that I'm going to show you today is available on GitHub. Here is the GitHub repository, and here is the QR code. So if you want to have the code, feel free to take it. I also record most of my sessions on video and publish them on YouTube. So the first session that I did today will become available shortly, and this session will also be available on YouTube if the recording technology works, and you can copy the link from there if you want. Okay, let's get right into it. What is Azure OpenAI and why should you care? Well, OpenAI, the company which developed these GPT models that we all know and love, they offer these GPT models as a service, as you probably know. And you might ask yourself, why is it relevant to run them in Azure? I mean, OpenAI and Microsoft have a partnership, right? So if you have a contract with OpenAI, you're already in Azure. Why having Microsoft as an intermediary in the middle? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's enterprise readiness. OpenAI is a great platform if you always want to have the coolest, latest, best technology, best models. If Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, presents a new model and you want to have it immediately on the next day to start working on it, then OpenAI is the company that you want to have your contract with. If you work in a larger company and you're thinking about where is my data processed? Does it leave the European Union? How do I authenticate? Do we use Entra ID, also known as Azure Active Directory? Do we have a firewall? My Chief Security Information Officer forces me to have a firewall in front of any service that we use. How do you do that with OpenAI? Answer, you don't. This is exactly why there is Azure OpenAI. Azure is essentially the GPT models from OpenAI made enterprise ready. And this is the topic of my talk today. I would like to show you what you can do, and I want to show you some code samples from infrastructure as code, how you can deploy the GPT models on Azure to get all these advantages that I was just talking about. So, the service is called Azure OpenAI, and if you would like to use Azure OpenAI, the first thing that you need to do is you need to apply for it. What? I mean, you already have a contract with Microsoft, right? Why do you need an additional apply form like that? Well, it's simple. There is a program at Microsoft which is called Responsible AI, and this program contains ideas where Microsoft says for what you can use AI and which application areas are not allowed when you consume the services from Microsoft. So there are additional end-user license agreements. There is, for instance, a responsible AI code of conduct. So therefore, before you start with OpenAI in Azure, you have to go through this form You have to say, yes, this is the most important thing here, I acknowledge blah, blah, blah. So you have to read these things, you have to discuss these things with your managers, with your legal team, and then you have to click on that, and on the bottom you say submit. Then this thing will be checked by Microsoft. My personal experience is that most times it's just going through within a few business hours, maybe some business days, but then you can start working with OpenAI. So this is the first task you have if you want to use OpenAI in Azure. You have to plan with a little bit of time so that you check these license agreements, and if they are okay, you have to submit this form, and then you're good. I already did that, obviously, so I can show you things, but keep that in mind. That might slow down the process a little bit. It's not slowed down by Microsoft, but when I work with larger companies, even finding someone who is able to make the decision if you are allowed to click on submit is sometimes not the trivial thing. Yeah? Sometimes the legal departments aren't as fast as we want them to be. Okay, now one of the most important arguments why you use Azure OpenAI is because you want to have control where your data is stored and where your data is processed. And we all know Microsoft has lots of data centers all over the world. Great, right? So let's take Azure OpenAI and process everything in Germany. Or let's take Azure OpenAI and when the Austrian data center gets online, let's process everything in Austria. I am super sorry, but I have to tell you, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that, because there is a super important page here, which you find in the Azure OpenAI documentation under modals here. You can go down here, and there is a region availability table. And in this region availability table, you have to take a very close look where which modal is made available. If you, for instance, take a look at the famous, awesome GPT-4o model, and you want to scroll down a little bit, you see East US, North Central US, South Central US. But here, we have a very important check. It's in Sweden. So if you would like to run GPT-4o as of today in Azure, the only data center that you have available is Sweden. So please check this availability matrix. If new models come out, you can't expect Microsoft to offer them immediately on the next business day in Europe. They are very likely only offered in the US, and some weeks or months later, they will come to certain data centers in Europe. Why do they do that? Don't they like Europe? That's not the case. The problem is simply availability of hardware resources. The speed with which concrete becomes dry because they're building physical data centers. Those are the limiting factors why these things are not available everywhere immediately. And that's the reason why it makes sense, maybe makes sense, to have a contract with both companies, OpenAI and Azure OpenAI. Use OpenAI to always get the latest and greatest stuff, do the development stuff, do the prototypes there, and when it comes to production, think about Azure OpenAI. It makes sense to have both. Now, there is a second possibility to run Azure OpenAI. That's with the provisioned mode. The provisioned mode is something where I can't help you because you need a Microsoft account manager in order to get a provisioned deployment. So if you are a large customer and you have a Microsoft account manager and you are planning a really big implementation of Azure OpenAI, and you need certain reserved capacity in the data centers, then you are going to talk about provisioned deployments with Microsoft. And there we have different rules. Because if you take a look at GPT-4o, here for instance, this is GPT-4o, we can scroll down and you can, for instance, use Japan. You can use Korea, and also you can use Switzerland North. So keep that in mind. If you are an enterprise customer of a certain size, with a very close relationship to Microsoft, and you have larger projects, you have additional data centers available. So 2 different deployment modes. For everybody, standard. This is what I mentioned before. For the large ones, with the big projects, provisioned. Okay, keep that in mind. That's an important one. So in my case, I did certain deployments, and as you can see here, I deployed, oh, that's the wrong resource group, sorry. that is the resource group that I wanted to use. I deployed a bunch of resources here, or one resource in this particular case, Azure OpenAI in Sweden, as you can see it here in Sweden Central. So if we want to use this thing, absolutely no problem. You simply say create resource Azure OpenAI, fill in a bunch of fields. It's completely serverless. You do not have to deploy virtual machines or Docker or Kubernetes or whatever. It's like Azure Storage. You simply say, I want to have OpenAI, and that's it. But then comes the interesting part. We can do a lot of interesting things with the Azure deployment. And I would like to go through these possibilities, and after a few minutes, when we talked about them, we will take a look at infrastructure as code, as Bicep scripts and everything else, so you understand how you can automate these features and what they do and how they look like. The first thing is authentication. If you use OpenAI, you always have to use API keys. You can create keys. Recently, they started new features. There are now project-specific API keys, but at the end of the day, you have an API key. And let me tell you something, I hate API keys. I hate them because I have to store them. Sometimes I check them in, and then I'm angry with myself because I checked them in, and I forgot how to get rid of them in GitHub, so I have to roll them forward, and it's a big mess. So I personally don't like API keys. And I guess your security information officers also don't like API keys. And I have a very good news for you. With Azure OpenAI, you can deactivate API keys. You can disable local authentication. Unfortunately, you can't do it through the portal. I have no idea why they did it like that. So you have to use scripted deployment in order to turn that off. But you can. So it's not obvious that it's possible, but you should do it. If you turn off API keys, you have to use Entra ID. Many of you are probably familiar with managed identity. Can I have a quick show of hands who is familiar with Azure Managed Identity? Lots of you. Okay, I would say half, two-thirds, something like this. Very good. For the other part of the audience, if you use Azure and you're not familiar with managed identity, let me tell you, you are missing something out. So definitely make a mental or physical note, managed identity, watch some videos or read up in the documentation. It's awesome because managed identity removes the need of API keys. I only have 45 minutes, so I can't give you a complete introduction into managed identity. You will see it in action in a few minutes, but it's really worthwhile playing with that. So that's the first thing, and that's a huge factor for many enterprise customers. I work with a lot of large worldwide acting companies, and in many companies they have governance rules that say no API key, and if you use API key, you have to switch these API keys every few weeks, and that's toil. Nobody wants to do that. So with that, you can get rid of it. The next thing that I would like to point out is networking. This is a very important one. You can have a firewall around OpenAI. The first thing, you can specify which networks can access, let's use that one, which networks can access OpenAI. So you can limit essentially the IP address ranges from which you can access your OpenAI deployments. Okay, that's the first one. But even more interesting is private endpoints. Private endpoints are supported for OpenAI. Another quick show of hands. Who is familiar with private endpoints in Azure? Okay, fewer, maybe a quarter, something like this. So let me quickly draw a little bit. How does private endpoints work? Imagine that this is your Azure environment. Inside of your Azure environment, let's use another color, you create a virtual network. Maybe this virtual network even has a virtual private network connection into your own data center or into your own corporate LAN, okay? Into your local area network. This virtual network is then used to deploy certain resources. I will here write apps, virtual machines, app service, container apps, Kubernetes clusters, whatever you use for running your applications. So they are limited, they are embedded in a virtual network. That's nice, but what about OpenAI? With private endpoints, what you can do is you have outside, somewhere here, OpenAI. This is run by Microsoft, so you cannot move OpenAI into your VNet. That's not possible because that's a serverless service and Microsoft cares for running it. So what you can do is you can create a network endpoint within your VNet. And this is called a private endpoint. This gives you a local IP address inside of your VNet. And then you can say only apps that run inside of this VNet are allowed to access my private endpoint. And that gives you a lot of control on the network level to make sure that nobody from outside can access your precious OpenAI endpoints. And of course, if you have a VPN with your office sitting behind this VPN, of course this office also is capable of accessing the private endpoint because they can use the VPN connection and go to your VNet and from the VNet to the private endpoint and you're good. This is a super important thing because I know a lot of enterprise customers who have policies that say backend services must not be accessible over the public internet. They want to have a second and third layer of security. It's not enough to have encryption. It's not enough to have authentication. They simply want to make sure that even if something bad happens with authentication or encryption, that still our services are not available over the public internet. And this is exactly what you can do with private endpoints. I will show you how to do that in a second. Another reason why you might consider Azure OpenAI over OpenAI. The next thing that I would like to talk about is the deployments themselves. There is a dedicated portal for working with the deployments. So assume you created the OpenAI resource, you configured private endpoints like you want them to be, you configured authentication like you want it to be, and then you would like to deploy certain models. You do that not through the Azure portal, but through the OpenAI Studio. It's very simple to reach. You simply click on this button here, this one, and then you get into the studio. In Azure OpenAI, you have to explicitly deploy the models that you would like to use within your Azure OpenAI resource. So it's not like you deploy Azure OpenAI and then you have GPT-4o or GPT-4 Turbo or GPT-3.5 Turbo. None of these models are available. You have to do a second step. You must create a deployment, as you can see here. Then you select the model that you would like to use. I'm going to use for demonstration purposes this one. Then you can use whether you want to have a specific version or whether you want to do auto-update. And that's the next enterprise feature which is important. If OpenAI launches a new version of GPT-4, it will be available for everybody immediately. The startups in the room will love this because they always want to have the newest and greatest stuff. The enterprise customers in the room, they are a little bit afraid of that because they are doing thorough testing, for instance. And they don't like services to behave differently on the next business day because they have to test this stuff and they have to, it has to go through a certain process for getting it available, making it available to the end customer. I think you know what I mean, right? And in Azure, you have control over whether you want to have auto-update or not. But keep in mind, these models are sometimes outphased. You have a sundowning process, so these models are available for a certain amount of time, but still, in that amount of time, you have a stable environment. Many people underestimate how difficult it is to do quality assurance in AI systems, because it's no longer just your code, it's your prompts. And your prompts might behave completely different on a new version of an AI model. So it's really necessary to test this stuff. And this gives you a little bit of extra stability, which is important for enterprise customers. By the way, here you could, if you have an Azure Account Manager, you could use the provision model, which I don't have, so therefore it's not available for me. Finally, we can use the content filtering. And that's also a very important part in Azure. For that, I'm going to cancel here and go to content filter. Please note that some of the features are marked with preview here. So not all that I show you here in this specific part is available for public use yet. So let's let's edit this content filter. What you see here on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side is configurable content filtering. What does content filtering in general mean? Whenever you interact with Azure OpenAI, you have content filters in place. And they check for hate speech, sexually explicit language, self-harm language, and violence. And they check that in the input, meaning the prompt, and they check that in the output, meaning the completion. And it's rather new that you can configure the level of content filtering. Maybe you are creating a solution for, let's say, kids. Then you probably want to have high content filtering. Maybe you are creating something that is targeted for internal users and they are all adults and they know what they are doing and you want to limit the number of false positives, then you might decide for low content filtering. If you have a special relationship with Microsoft and you go through a certain vetting process, you can even turn off content filtering at all, but this is not available for the general public. You have to talk to Microsoft if you want to do that. For instance, if you are a researcher and you would like to research the behavior of these models, then you can turn content filtering off. But as normal Azure users, content filterings will always be present and the default setting is medium. Okay? So this is the first thing that you can do. The second thing, what you can do is you can enable prompt shielding. Prompt shielding are specifically trained models which take a look at the prompts and they detect certain attack vectors. Similar to, as programmers, you might be familiar with SQL injection, for instance. This is something similar but for prompts. So you can turn on prompt shielding, and please read the documentation if you want to know more. Down here, you see that you can turn on protection for protected material text and protected material code. So, for instance, if a user asks for a song text, for instance, which is under copyright, then this filter will recognize that and it will not deliver the song text to the end user. So they are checking for copyright violations. It depends whether you want that or not. Turn it on or turn it off. Last but not least, it is possible to add block lists for certain things, for certain websites and so on. Please read the documentation if this is relevant. And this is not relevant, I will not go into the details, and we are good. Once you have set up such a content filter, you can go back to your deployment here, and if you have this deployment, you can assign the content filter here, and then this deployment will use your configured content filter. Again, this is important especially for enterprise customers. It's similar to a firewall which, as I said, detects certain OWASP vulnerabilities for web traffic. But this is for prompting and for responses of the large language model. Are we good? Another important thing to consider. Yes, you have a question. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Very good. Nice. Good. So, I think those are the most important features. Let me check. Yeah, I think we can switch to our infrastructure as code. How can we deploy this stuff? Now, for my talk today, I created a very simple application. This application works like that. We have the browser here on the front, not browser I meant. We have the browser, then we have our own application. In this case, I'm using Node.js with TypeScript, but you could imagine any other programming language too. The programming language is not relevant here. And then we have our Azure OpenAI here in the background. The important thing is that my application has a bunch of interesting features. First, everything is embedded in a VNet. So we want to have a VNet. I would like to demonstrate that we are using a VNet here. The second thing that we are using here for Azure OpenAI is a private endpoint. So I'm going to show you how we can embed OpenAI into our own VNet to have local IP addresses. And last but not least, we are using for authentication here, we are using managed identity. So we are not using any API keys, we are preventing the use of API keys. Well, and then we have a browser which accesses this app. By the way, this app in my example runs as a Docker container in Azure App Service. So this is the setting that we created here. And we would like to automate the entire deployment process. No manual clicking around in the portal. We have infrastructure as code and we have continuous deployment. That's the idea here. Let's start with the infrastructure. Now what I created for you is a bunch of Bicep files. Show of hands, who is familiar with Bicep? Okay, who is familiar with Terraform? Okay, some of you, maybe Azure CLI or maybe Azure PowerShell. Okay, so maybe you've heard from Bicep. Bicep is infrastructure as code. I think a third of you didn't raise their hands, so let me quickly tell you that. I always tell my Azure customer in trainings that it is not a good idea to use the Azure portal in real-world development in Azure. The Azure portal is great for learning. The Azure portal is great for testing. The Azure portal is great for looking something up, read-only access. But you shouldn't use the Azure portal when you do real-world development. It's like changing your database through a graphical UI. No developer would do that. Probably you would write your alter table statements and store them somewhere so you can update the test environment and the production environment, or you use something like Entity Framework to create migrations and you would be able to reapply the migrations to multiple stages or something like this. This is exactly the same but on an infrastructure level. Okay? So use Bicep, Terraform or any other platform, but use infrastructure as code. Ignore the Azure portal for real-world development. Now, in my example here, I split everything up in the network configuration. That's the first part. Then the OpenAI deployment. That's an interesting one. And then the web application. I'm not going to focus on that one because that is not the topic of my talk today. First, the network. It's pretty simple and pretty straightforward. What I create here is a virtual network with a certain IP address range. Please keep that in mind. We have a 10-something IP address range here. And as you can see, we have some subnets, and one important subnet is the private endpoint subnet. This is exactly where our OpenAI will land. So that will be a 10.0.11 something IP address. Let's see whether it works. Everything else is nothing special, it's just private endpoints. It has nothing to do with OpenAI. If you're not familiar with these resources in Azure, I have everything in GitHub. You can look it up later on, you can play with it. I only have 45 minutes, so I have to focus on OpenAI. Good. Let's take a look at the second Bicep file, and this is the interesting one. In this Bicep file, we start by deploying, I will zoom in, a Microsoft Cognitive Services account. Now you might wonder, what is Cognitive Services? Well, that has historical reasons. For historical reasons, all the AI-related parts in Azure were called Cognitive Services. But with the rise of OpenAI, Cognitive Services, well, they are still there, but they are not so important anymore. But still, Microsoft took OpenAI and put it under the technical name Cognitive Services because historically this is in Azure where all the AI stuff is. So if you look for something AI related in Azure, you have a lot of fancy marketing terms like Azure AI search and things like that. But technically, as developers, everything is called Cognitive Services something. So everything starts with a Cognitive Services account. This is the first thing that you need. And then you have this magic, very self-explanatory setting, which is called kind. And you have to call it magic string OpenAI. And that is your door into OpenAI in your Cognitive Services account. You simply have to know that. And now you know because you have my slides here. And then you have a bunch of very interesting settings, and the most important two settings from a security perspective, if you ask me, are public network access disabled, which turns off network access from the public internet only our VNet has now access to OpenAI, and the second is disable local auth, and that simply gets rid of the API keys. No API keys, no access from the public internet. Woohoo, our security guys are happy now. This is exactly what we need. So don't change these two settings if you want to have the best possible security. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you are doing something fundamentally wrong if you enable public network access and if you enable local authentication. If you really care for your API keys and you manage them professionally, there's nothing wrong with API keys, but you have to manage them professionally. API keys get bad when you don't care about them, when you give them to your intern who is only there in your company for 2 weeks and then has fun playing with OpenAI during his rest of the study. This is what you don't want to have, okay? So if you care for your API keys, I'm fine with that. Also, public internet access. Hey, OpenAI services are built for a zero-trust environment. You can use it from the public internet. They are fine. They have firewalls, they have authentication, they have encryption, everything is there. The network isolation is just an additional layer of security in case you do something wrong. So if you lose your API key and some bad hackers from the other part of the world get your API keys, if you encapsulate OpenAI only in your VNet, they still can't do anything with these API keys. That's the idea. It's an additional layer of security if something gets wrong. Okay, very nice. Once we have deployed the Cognitive Services account, we are then deploying the modal. And here you see, this is how you can deploy certain modals in your account. So in my case, I'm deploying GPT-4o here with a certain version. Where do you get this version number from or version date from? From the documentation. There is a table that mention all the different models which are available, and there you see all the version numbers, and you can here specify the version. And if you want to deploy a new version, change your infrastructure as code script and reapply it, and you will get an upgraded version. Are we good? So this is how you automatically deploy your OpenAI service. The rest is also very important, but not OpenAI specific, because here I am creating the private endpoint. This private endpoint creates the resource through which we can access OpenAI inside of our VNet. This gives us a local IP address. Got it? Good? So don't forget it. I'm not going into details here. I only have 45 minutes. I said it before. Take a look at the code. It's on Git. I created a script. This is a bash script that you can run locally. Just get your own Azure account, submit this form to get OpenAI, and then you can take my application and simply run this script, and it will deploy everything for you. Okay? Maybe you choose a different name. This is it, and this deploys everything for you. You can also do that in a GitHub Action or an Azure DevOps pipeline. With that, you can fully automate your entire infrastructure deployment. I did that up front because the deployment of this whole script takes between 5 and 10 minutes, and this would take too long. But I deployed it, I think, an hour ago. So it really works. I tested it. Now, let's take a look at this deployment so you see it. This is exactly the deployment that I created. Let me make that a little bit larger. And for instance, this is the private endpoint resource. And as you can see, this is the name of my Azure OpenAI deployment. It's an auto-generated name, that's fine. And this is the local IP address, you see? So, point proven, we can really deploy OpenAI in our VNet with a local IP address. Good. The rest, I mean, yeah, it's just resources. Take a look. Let's take a look at the application. I created a very simple application, and if you're not an application developer, don't worry, you will understand the code. It's not difficult. In this case, I used Express.js with TypeScript. For debugging purposes, I created an endpoint which says status. And in this endpoint, I print out certain information which is really interesting. For instance, we can take a look at the IP address of OpenAI from the viewpoint of our web application. This is just there to prove to you that it's really a local IP address. It's not the public internet IP address. Additionally, I'm showing you the token, the JWT token, JWT, JSON Web Token, which is used to access OpenID. And this should prove the point that we are really using managed identity, not an API key. So these are just outputs that should prove to you that it really works. And this is really important what you see out there. Never do that in production. It's a horrible idea to have a status endpoint where you print a JWT token to the user. Really bad idea. Only do it in presentation scenarios. And I only show you a substring, so I'm not showing you the entire key. But still, keep your tokens private. But for demonstration purposes, that's fine. And additionally, I just created a very simple web form, which you see here, where I can type in a question, which is then sent to Azure OpenAI via managed identity through a local IP address. And if everything works out nicely, we should get a response through this web application. So let's give it a try and let's take a look. Here is my app service. Let's open it up, and here it is. Before we go into that one, let's take a look at the status. Good. So the things that are important for my talk are this one, and this one. Let's start with the token. For those of you who are familiar with managed identity and Entra ID, you probably recognize the EYJ at the beginning. That's the typical start of a JWT token. It's a token provided to you by Azure, by Azure Active Directory. Let me show you how I acquired this token. Let's take a look at the, where is it? I clicked on the wrong one. Here it is. See that one? I'm using default Azure credentials. With that, I tell my program, hey, use Entra ID. I'm not having an API key for you. And then you have to retrieve a token, and this is again a magic string. You simply have to know that you have to pass in this magic string. With this magic string, you get a JWT token for OpenAI. And the token that you get here can then be used whenever you send a request to Azure OpenAI. It's just a two-liner, very simple. It looks exactly the same in .NET, it looks exactly the same in Python. The syntax is a little bit different, but the principle is always the same. Okay? So this is how you authenticate. And this is the reason why I have a token here. The Azure Service IP is the second important thing. Here, as you can see here, where is it? Where is it? Where is the DNS query? It's somewhere in the status page here, I think. Where is the DNS query? Resolve IP address. I created a helper function. You see, I'm using a DNS lookup. Now you have to understand that for every Azure deployment, and you see that exactly here, you get a custom domain name. This domain name here at the front, you can influence that. I auto-generated this deployment name. So you are no longer accessing something like, I don't know, api.openai.com, but you get your private deployment. And the important thing when you deploy everything with a private endpoint is that Azure is providing DNS resolution so that this endpoint suddenly does no longer resolve to a public IP address, but this endpoint resolves to a private IP address in your VNet. And this is exactly what's going on here. I simply resolve the name and I do not get a public IP address. I showed it to you before. This is exactly a 10-point-something IP address, so it's a local IP address. Nobody from outside can access our OpenAI. And this is exactly, again, what makes our security guys happy. Fine. So the setting looks great. So let's see whether our application works. Do you have any questions? Well, what do you think about the tech conference in Vienna. Let's see, submit. I do not use streaming here, so it's really, really simple. Okay. It doesn't have any personal opinions. Anything, why is the sky blue? That's the traditional question that everybody is asking, so we get something. But you already saw it. It works perfectly. We now can access OpenAI through a private IP address with a jar token that we got from EnterID. We simply have to wait a little bit because I was too lazy to implement streaming. So we have to wait until the model is finished creating a long argument why the sky is blue. And hopefully in a few more moments, we will get an answer. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. I'm super happy that you saw it before. Let's give it another 5 seconds. Let's try it again. Tell me a joke in German. Let's see. Whatever. I'm so glad that you saw that the first request went through. That's always the same if you do something like this. Some strange glitch happened here. I will keep it running and I will tell you I didn't get any errors. No errors here, just no answer. We'll see. But I think you got the point with the status endpoint, right? So, I'm already 3 minutes away from the end of my talk, and I will check whether I get an answer in a second. Let me repeat quickly what I said, the most important talking points. First, use Azure OpenAI if you work in a large company where governance, data sovereignty, firewalls, and everything like that is really important. You have to live with it that there is a certain time lag between published new models and making those models available in Azure. If that is okay for you, Azure is a really good place to be. Think about managed identity, think about private endpoints, think about content filtering, and think about conscious updating of your models. All these things are available in Azure. Don't forget to use infrastructure as code, like with Bicep or Terraform, and then everything should be fine. And this is our joke. Warum können Geister so schlecht lügen? Weil man durch sie hindurch sieht. Oh, that's not a good joke, but my software worked, and that is the important one. So don't judge my session based on the joke that ChatGPT told you. I'm at the end of the time and I'm at the end of my content. It's always a good idea if those two things come together. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for joining my session or my sessions. I enjoyed being here at Tech Conference and I think we can open it up for a few questions. Thank you very much.